heard. If my order is correct, we're now going to listen to something by Dario Castello, Sonata Decimasesta. We're essentially now in an extraordinary world. We're in a world where everything is new. We're in Italy in the first half of the 17th century, where great musical discoveries have been made and great new musical forms are being tried out. We can talk about instrumental music, sonata forms, but also the rise of something which is going to be a kind of an international sort of affliction by the mid-18th century. That's to say, virtuosity. How can you play faster than anybody else? What are the limits, technically speaking, of an instrument? And this combined with newness of forms, newness of instruments, is going to give us one of the most exciting moments, I think, in musical history. It's the rise of opera, it's the beginning of opera, but it's also the beginnings of an extraordinary instrumental phenomenon, which is essentially the art of virtuoso playing. We've got some marvelous people, as we've had marvelous people here. I should really mention their names. Did I mention Jonathan Slade and Oliver Weston and A.U.G. Lee, our French musicians? And now we have Augusta McKay Lodge, or is it McKay? I'm not sure. Annie Gard, Stephen Goist, Keiran Campbell, Hugo Abraham, and Robert Warner. A big ensemble. Of coaching and directing all of these young musicians in the program for tomorrow evening. By the way, if you don't have tickets, I'd hurry to get some, because it's going to be a great show. Dazzling. What are the adjectives that one could use after hearing this? Well, surprising, dazzling, virtuoso, yes, theatrical, innovative, yes. Certainly very different adjectives than one would use for the previous piece of Couperin, where we could talk about affecting, sentimental, intimate, the message being for just one or two of you. This is something that can bring us all together saying, whew, gosh, it's fast and loud and it's got the most extraordinary sense of almost kind of pugnacious vitality. Let's talk about the piece. It's early, isn't it? Yes. What date is it? We're talking essentially about music which is almost 80 years, 90 years before Couperin.
Early 17th century.
Yeah. What are they trying to prove here? First of all, is this music like the Couperin? Does it have a link with language? I'm making faces because obviously I want to give you the answer. But
well, we don't know that much about Castello, but he's from the time period of Monteverdi, and a lot of what they were doing was discovering new affects. So, you know, love, war, things like that. And this piece uses love. Stile Concitato, which is the fast notes, the warlike sound. So it's not so much about text as it is just about meaning and feeling.
About effects of sort, yes. But there's also an extraordinary sense of construction as well. This is a far more complicated piece than a piece for un dessus, like the flute, and a little rather discrete accompaniment of a bass de viola and harpsichord. Here we're pulling out the stops because essentially we're dealing with new forms. What is the sonata, for example? And what makes this particular piece a sonata? Is there a form? I'm looking at Augusta, but we could share the conversation. Yes.
I mean, it has many different sections with different tempi.
We've got series, essentially, contrasted movements, and especially contrasting in terms of what? Tempo. Yes, yes, yeah. Is it a closed form? I mean, do we have essentially a structure whereby we come back to something? Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yes, essentially. We close the door with a repeat, essentially, of what we had done initially. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about methods and materials. The material, you're using a modern edition. Yes. How do we know it's good? What's the problem with a modern edition? Well, sometimes nothing. Sometimes, we need an edition that has been made the day before yesterday by a competent musicologist, who's studied perhaps a manuscript, or he's taken the original source material of 1629 or whatever, and made it more legible for us. Sometimes putting it in modern notation, sometimes just cleaning it up, because many times manuscripts and even sort of early printed stuff is pretty difficult to read. Yeah. But how we know, after all, we're early musicians now, specialists in early music. So essentially, we need a good text, don't we? How do we know this is a good text?
Well, we do have the manuscript. We worked from it a little bit.
In other words, you've got someone who's advising you. Yeah, he's called Robert Mealy. And he's a good fellow. Knows a great deal about this music. Yes, you've got to find yourself in good hands. Now, does this mean that I'm saying that we can also be sidetracked and essentially give off horrible interpretations to people like you because of a bad edition? Well, that used to be the case, wasn't it? When I grew up, there used to be something called favorite pieces of composers of yesteryear, some silly garbage like that. And the accompaniments for some of these beautiful pieces were actually just simply designed to be played on the piano by someone who had absolutely no knowledge whatsoever of 17th or 18th century music. And it sounds like kind of watered down Massenet, or bad Brahms, or sometimes even worse. Can we get sidetracked like that in this particular style? A little bit less so, I would say, yeah. This is for essentially an audience that knows a little bit about historic performance and historic styles. Yeah. Now let's talk about the difficulties. It's not that difficult, is it? Really, no. And its principal effect is what? To make a big statement to you people. Yes. This is the newness, you see. This music is not old like Couperin. Couperin, did he know this music? Well, he grew up understanding, of course, that there was a fundamental difference between French style and Italian style. But not only in music. Couperin would be talking as an architect, would talk about the difference between French architecture and Italian architecture, or a painter, or what have you. This music is essentially the equivalent of what I saw at the Met last week, Valentin de Boulogne, a post-Caravaggio painter, essentially the same period. We're talking about the first and the very beginning of the second half of the 17th century. There's strong kinship between what I saw at this marvelous exhibition at the Met and this music. Yes, it's painted with a big brush. Yeah, we're not dealing with that little ornament that I asked Jonathan to play, you know. Dum, ba-dum, da-dum, bum. Yes, everything quiet and with great detail. We're dealing something with, in the same way that one sees these extraordinary canvases of the Caravaggio painters, with a big, broad brush. And that's what I like about this performance. It's brassy. It's got, yeah. Can we play it could we play it differently? Well, of course, yeah. But I think I like the verve. I like the enthusiasm that you're bringing to this music, which is exactly the same thing that all baroque art of the 17th century wants, essentially. Very important. Yeah. Have any of you gone off to the exhibition at the Met? Ah, that's good. Yeah. I love it when, you know, when musicians around me say, yes, I'm kind of familiar with the visual side of things, you know, or the literary side of things. It is important. Perhaps more important for us now than a pianist knowing essentially the art that Franz Liszt was surrounding himself with in the 1870s and 80s. This is very important. Music, painting, literature, sculpture. I mean, who's the best sculptor actually in Baroque Italy? Sorry? Bernini. That's very nice to hear. Yeah. Did Bernini make music? He did, actually. In fact, he was involved in some of the most extraordinary musical events in Rome. Yes, very much so. Paul, do you have anything to say about this piece? Paul, by the way, Paul has just received the Gramophone Early Music Award for Monteverdi. So he's got a lot to say about Italian music. The Monteverdi madrigals, which Paul has essentially now completed the entire cycle, well, it makes me very proud because it's under the label of the Art Florissant. Yes, I'm sure that you've got lots to say about this.
Yeah, I wondered, you know, this piece is called, in the title it says in Stil Moderno. Which bit of it is modern? So if this is in the modern style, what was the old style?
More contemporary. So it's not as horizontal texture, as more independent lines.
I think it's absolutely that. So before in Renaissance music we had these different lines, and they would build up one after another, and they would all play more or less the same tune. Sometimes, you know, displaced by a fourth, that's polyphonic music. And here we don't have polyphonic music, we have homophonic music, for the most part. And that seems to me, that's an essential difference. Of course, for music which has text, that's amazing. Because if everyone sings the text at exactly the same time, homophonically, like you're all playing together, pom, pop, pop, pom, pom, it means we hear the text. Whereas when we're singing polyphonically, someone starts the text, someone else starts the text, someone starts the text here, and then the bass starts the text, and the soprano's already gone on to the next text, and we get completely lost. And so this music comes from this vocal idea of having homophony in order to get clarity. But this concitato, what's that about?
Well, it's a new style that Monteverdi developed in Tancredi.
Yes, exactly, in Tancredi, great. And what's it about?
Basically, they didn't necessarily have a way to show a warlike or excited affect until he developed these repeated
Exactly.
notes.
He says, there's a foreword to the 8th book, and he says, I'm doing okay. I think I've got sad music sorted out. I've got melodic music sorted out, but I don't have any war music sorted out. And so I need to get some war music sorted out. And he takes the Combattimento di Tancredi Clorinda from Jerusalem Liberata, from Tasso, which is this battle between two people who don't know who each other is. And of course, it turns out that they're in love with each other only at the moment when, unfortunately, Tancredi kills Clorinda. That's the way it goes. But it means that we are supposed to be at battle. And so you get these rather beautiful moments of quiet, and then you get these battle moments. And I think a little bit like the way in which we heard the French music, we have to go a lot further. These were, Monteverdi, and we don't have any treatise from Dario, so we don't know exactly what he was trying to do here. But we can look at Monteverdi, who's doing exactly the same in the same town. Castello was in Venice, and we also know that there's a later publication of his which talks about San Marco. So we know that he played in San Marco, and who was the chief in San Marco? Well, it was Claudio Monteverdi. So he certainly played under the direction of Claudio Monteverdi. So we can look at Claudio Monteverdi's treatise, or his introduction to the Book 8, and so we need to get these different affects. He's obsessed with affect, and we have to decide what that affect is, and then transmit it. Sorry, I just seem to be talking to you, Augusta, but transmit it. I'm going to go. We have to transmit it to the audience. So the audience is never in any doubt whether it's warlike, whether it's love-like, whether, what we're trying to say.
But why did we have to write Allegro? That's the question one should ask these kids too. What is the time signature here? I see something very, very bizarre, which you've had to digest. I see a binary indication C, and then I see a ternary indication right next to it. Do you know what that means?
Divided by 2.
It has to do with prolation, but it also is, at this moment in musical history, we're a bit confused, composers, about how they put things down on paper. But we do know that these are very precious indications of tempo, you see. Yeah. We don't need Allegro. This is why I said, and Paul is re-saying, editions are very important. And we've got to understand the criteria of finding a good one or a bad one. In doubt, Paul is right. You simply go back to the first source, What did Benjamin Franklin write, that day, in 1765, What did the composer do when he had the manuscript in his hand? Yes, that's important. It's crucial. I know an editor who was editing Monteverdi, editing one of the grand pieces, actually. He was editing the Coronazione di Poppea. And he thought that we were too stupid, essentially, to understand old notation. Well, we were maybe 25 or 30 years ago, and especially if you want to make a lot of money out of the edition by hawking it off to essentially every opera house in the world. But it gives a very, very false image and impression of the music. And it sounds as if it were a transcription of 1995.
I think when you see a word like adagio, it's a very loaded word. You know about Beethoven adagios, you know about Liszt adagios. You know, adagio is a very loaded word, and so when you see it, you can't help. You know, I see it and I think, oh, I don't. So many associations come in with adagio and you just can't. You can't step away with them. And I think sometimes in the way you played, had those associations with a sort of a. Now this is adagio. I think, well, it isn't.
Our timekeeper has now suggested that we do a summing up. What would I say about this performance? Well, I liked it. But as Paul said, go further, which is exactly what we said to our people playing Couperin. Go further in what the music wants, essentially. And this, we're talking about modern music. We're flogging a new horse. Yes. We're trying to show people that this concertato style is something that really is vivacious and irresistible. Yeah, but I think you're well on your way. I'd like to say, too, that, I mean, we're talking now about a high level of student performance. In fact, it's very difficult for me to say this is a student performance. I told a few friends of mine at dinner last night that I could take the big orchestra, 415, on tour next week as a professional orchestra, doing a very difficult program of Jean-Philippe Rameau. And I could certainly imagine taking you all in my suitcase off to Europe and presenting you as a finely honed, well-worked young ensemble. This is very, very important.